Good evening and welcome to the Barron Oil Investor Webinar. My name's Tim Metcalf. I'm Managing Director of IFC Advisory, which is Barron's financial PR and IR advisor. With me today is Andy Yeo, who's Barron's CEO, John Ford, Barron's Technical Director, and we've got Andy Butler, Managing Director of Barron's subsidiary, Sunderguest Banda. The subject of today's webinar is obviously Barron's Chuditch project, and the team will run you through a presentation covering many aspects of that project, which will be followed by a question and answer session. I'd like to thank very much everybody who's sent in questions in advance. They're very, very appreciated and have helped to shape certain elements of the presentation. Obviously, when going through the questions at the end, there are topics that as a public company, Barron won't be able to address, but hopefully we'll be able to give you a good flavour of Chuditch and the enormous prospects there. Also, given the number of people we've got attending this evening, it obviously won't be possible to go to people individually, ask them to unmute and put their questions directly to the team. But given we do encourage questions, we would like you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, type in anything that you'd like me to ask, and I'll do my level best to ask those at the end of the presentation. But please do recognise that we've got nearly 500 people online tonight. I've had multiple questions sent in advance, and there's only a limit to the number we can go through, but we'll do our level best. Anyway, without further ado, I'll hand over to Andy Yeo to start the presentation. Andy.
Thanks, Tim. Before plunging into detail on Chuditch, I thought it might be useful to remind ourselves of Barron's corporate strategy, which is one of owning significant equity interests in high-impact oil and gas exploration and appraisal activities. Since 2020, we've been able to deliver significant increases in our stakes in Timor from 25% to 75%, and the P2478 licence in the UK from 15% to 32%. Chuditch has now reached a key evaluation point around the preliminary interpretation of the 3D seismic reprocessing, and we're going to focus on that tonight. But the Dunrobin prospect in the UK is not far behind. Suffice it to say, we've made significant progress on both assets, and from where we are, we're very encouraged. So back to Timor. The 3D seismic reprocessing has significantly improved the data quality, as you will see a little later. This has led to a fundamental change in our understanding of the way in which the field might be appraised. The Chuditch 1 appraisal well is likely, or was looking to test about 1.3 TCF of recoverable gas, which, if successful, would likely make the field commercial. Then the other prospects and leads come into play with something over 2.3 TCF to go after. In terms of independent validation, ERCE have been engaged to prepare a CPR, and we are hopeful of achieving a contingent resource around the Chuditch 1 discovery. On the farm out, we have generated a good level of interest, which is accelerating now that a 6-month extension is in place, the preliminary interpretation is available, and we are seeking external validation of our work via the CPR. I will now pass across to Dr. Andy Butler, who is responsible for our operations in Asia as operator of the Chuditch PSC.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Andy. Thank you very much, and hello to everybody from Singapore. It's my pleasure this evening to give you this update on Chuditch and all the progress that we're making with the project. So I thought I'd start by reminding everybody where we are, where we're working, and what's going on around us. So as you probably recall, Chuditch PSC is sat in the middle of the Timor Sea, halfway roughly between the island of Timor and the Northern Territories of Australia. It's the orange asset that's shown on the map here. And it sits right in the middle, the heart of an extensive gas fairway. Everything shown on the map in red are gas fields, very substantial fields, a fairway that's many hundreds of kilometres long. It extends from the Bioland facility to the west of us, which is the only producing field at the present time on this map and has been in production for about 18 years. Eastwards through Chuditch, a number of fields inside Australian waters, including Evans Shoal and Barossa as large fields, and onto Abadi inside Indonesia, a very extensive fairway of gas that's developed there, and Greater Sunrise, a very significant field to the north of us. And all of that gas is located within the same reservoir system, the same Jurassic sands as we have in Chuditch. So an enormous amount of gas that's on that fairway. We're sat right in the heart of it. And we're sat in the middle of a lot of activity commercially as well. So I'll point out a few things that are going on. Greater Sunrise is now majority owned by the government of Timor-Leste, who bought out the shares of ConocoPhillips and Shell a couple of years ago, so they now own about 56%. They partner with the operator Woodside, and there's extensive discussions going on between those parties and quite a lot in the media around this to take that asset forward, starting with a signature of a new PSC that is required as the basis for development. A key player in the basin is Santos. Santos acquired ConocoPhillips' portfolio in this area a couple of years ago, and in doing so picked up the Bayundan field, which I just mentioned, which they operate, and which they plan to convert into a carbon capture and storage facility in the near future when production ceases, which is still expected in the coming months. They also picked up the Barossa field, which is under which they've taken a final investment decision last year, and which first gas is predicted from 2025, and which will backfill the Darwin LNG facility, which is also part of the package, once Bayundan gas ceases to be delivered there. There's a slight delay at the moment with Barossa, with some judicial proceedings in Australia, but I don't think that will necessarily put things out for too far. Also, Santos have an MOU in place with ENI, who operate the large Evans Shoal discovery adjacent or close to Barossa, and they're looking to develop infrastructure together to evacuate some of the gas from this part of the basin. Okay. And coming closer to us, and again with ENI, they were awarded this year as part of the licensing round inside Timor-Leste. They were awarded an important block between ourselves and Greater Sunrise in the heart of that fairway. So a lot going on. The licensing round had some other awards as well, including Santos to the west. Obviously a lot of activity. And in terms of licensing rounds, the last point is within Australian waters to the south of us, two very large concessions were awarded to groups led by Inpex and Santos for carbon capture storage facilities, which are generally down in this area here. So there's a lot of focus in this basin for future gas supply, and also as an area where CCS is very appropriate. So if I zoom in a little bit towards Chuditch itself and remind you a bit about the asset. So we operate with a 75% controlling interest. We partner with Timor Gap, again the national oil company of Timor-Leste, and who are carried to first gas, and with whom we have an excellent joint venture working relationship. And the focus for us is, of course, the Chuditch discovery. It's why we were interested in this asset in the first place and what we've been working very hard. Chuditch was discovered by Shell in 1998. It sits in about 65 meters of water. It had encountered gas, about 25 meters of net gas, in the same excellent Jurassic plover sandstones which I was describing, and indeed some of the best examples of that plover sandstone in the basin. Up until the very recent work we've been carrying out, it was thought that the discovery itself contained about 700 billion cubic feet of gas recoverable. And we had identified about 4 adjacent prospects and leads, which took our total estimate on block for around about 3 trillion cubic feet of recoverable gas. Now, what we have been working very hard at is evaluating that discovery and the surrounding features in enormous detail. A lot of geological studies, and in particular, we have been reprocessing a very extensive area of 3D seismic data. About 1,270 square kilometers of reprocessed data has now been completed. That is a vast area. As I mentioned previously, I think that represents about the area of London inside the M25. And you're looking at the data in 25-meter chunks. So you can imagine there's vast amounts of data there. That work is complete, and with some very good results. And I'll show you a little bit about that in a moment. And so our focus now is on interpreting those data, making sure we get the most value out of that data, having spent a lot of time and effort doing that job, and producing new resource updates. And I'll talk you through some of those in a moment, and hopefully put some colour to some of the numbers that we've put out earlier this week. That will hopefully then take us towards appraisal drilling, which we're targeting to start from late next year. And ultimately, that appraisal drilling should get us onto a development pathway for an LNG scale project. Excuse me. And all of this work is going on. Do beg pardon. All this work going on in close liaison with our government partners in Timor Gap, and particularly AMPM, the regulator, again, with whom we have most excellent relationships. Okay. So before showing you where we've been going with the data, I thought I'd just remind everybody about the discovery itself and why we think it is such a good discovery that Shell made 25 years ago. So this is the first of a couple of slides with some technical content. I appreciate that probably not everybody on the call has a technical background, but I shall do my best to explain the detail therein. So the panel on the left-hand side here is illustrating the vertical section through the reservoir interval that was drilled. So it starts at about 2890 meters and goes down to the total depth drilled by the well, just around about 3000 meters. The yellow color on that map, this is basically just a log of the rock type that was encountered drilling through that section. Yellow represents sandstone, which is the reservoir, and you can see first of all that it's almost all sandstone. The interval that is highlighted in red up here is where the gas was encountered. We encountered the top of the gas, of course, at the top of the reservoir, but we encountered also the contact at the base of the gas where it sits on water. Okay, and then the hashed blank zone through there is porosity. You can see there's good porosity where the gas is sad, and that there's a lot of sandstone underneath the gas, and we believe that there's a lot more sandstone going further beneath the point at which the well stopped drilling. The green box there illustrates the quality of the reservoir that was encountered, and I'll talk through those numbers briefly. Now, net to gross represents basically how much of the rock is reservoir, almost 90%, as indicated, as you can see on the log there. So that's a very high amount. Porosities are also very good for gas reservoirs, 12% average, going up to about 18%. And a key parameter is permeability. Now, permeability represents the connectivity of that porosity, how the gas can move between pores, which is basically how it will ultimately, how those pores are connected, and so the gas can be pulled out through a well bore. Typically for a gas reservoir, you'd use a cutoff of 1 millidarcy. You can see that the average here is almost 200 millidarcies. So again, these are very good characteristics for a gas reservoir. And indeed going up to about 1000 millidarcies, these would flow exceptionally well. And of course, we thoroughly expect that to be the case because Bayondan, with very similar reservoirs to the west of us, has flowed exceptionally well for the last 18 years. Gas saturation basically means how much of that pore space is full of gas as opposed to the residual water next to it, and most of it is gas, as you see. So in summary, a very good reservoir, but what did it represent in terms of volumes of sales gas? And what we believed to be the case is that the well was drilled on the sides of a fairly large structure which was set up by a fault to the south of us, and at the top of the reservoir would rise up towards that fault, which is typical geologically, and that sets up a wedge zone, this sort of triangular zone, with the base of it defined by the gas water contact, which we know about because we found it Shell found it in the well. So overall, you've got this kind of thick wedge that's developed as a large tank for gas. So a great story, great idea, but still a model. And the issue that we've had is that it's very difficult to actually see that on the seismic data that we've got to see what happens between the well and the fault, and indeed precisely where the fault sits. Okay, so that was the challenge that we had, and what we have spent a lot of time doing then is reprocessing seismic data to try and resolve that question and see what the tank looks like. So what I've put up here are a couple of seismic profiles, and again, I appreciate these are technical information, so I shall do my best to explain them. There are two profiles here, but they are actually the same profile with different vintages of data. The panel on the left represents the data that Shell had to work with when they chose to drill the Chuditch well in the first place. So this is two-dimensional data, just single profiles acquired in the mid-1990s. And the panel on the right, which I'll come to second, are the data that we're presently working with. So the data on the left is, first of all, it's recorded, it represents two-way time data. Now what that means is basically the time it takes for the sound wave to travel from the boat at the surface, where a big air gun is let off, Sand travels through the earth, hits the different rock layers and bounces back up again. So you measure the time it takes for sound waves to come back, and it gives you responses on the different rock layers that it hits. And so the bigger lines here, the black lines you can follow, represent key interfaces between rock types. So this, for example, here, this is the key interval. This is very close to the top of the Plover reservoir we're working with. Okay. So I hope that's clear, and I hope what you can see, just broadly speaking, is that the data quality actually looks fairly reasonable in that I can point at these things, I can follow them around. You can see this, the purple line here, that's an interpretation on which mapping is based. Okay, that's true on the left-hand side of the panel. It's true on the right-hand side of the panel. It's at a different level. There's a fault somewhere in between. But the problem is that there is this zone in the middle, which I annotated with a red dashed line and marked as impossible to interpret, because it is extremely difficult to see what's going on in this zone in here. How do you connect from both sides? And the issue, of course, is that's where the gas sits. Okay, there's somewhere in here, there is a fault. Somewhere in here, there is, we believe, some gas, but we can't see it on those data very clearly at all. You can attempt to map it, but it's very difficult. So that's what we've been trying to address. So it takes me to the right-hand panel, which is the new data. Now, these are data that are shown as on a depth scale. So what we've done is build a very complex velocity model of the structure of the Earth above us and in this region to enable us to convert the time into depth by applying the different velocities to the different rock types that are encountered at different levels. And we think that has been pretty successfully applied. So what we're now able to see critically, the data quality is pretty good. But what we're able to do is address what happens in this middle zone here. So we can see very clearly where there is a fault. I've marked it here in black to illustrate it, but it's pretty clearly defined. And we can track the interval that looks like the top of the reservoir all the way towards that fault. So for the first time, we're able to map the zone between the well, which was drilled roughly in a location like here, to the fault itself, which means we can understand basically what is in that zone. And don't forget, we're also now dealing with three-dimensional data, which means you can scroll through profiles, you can look in whichever direction you wish to, you can interrogate these data in all dimensions to map it out in a great deal more detail. So the annotation on the right-hand side, this is the same profile again, but where I've just made it a bit simpler to see what I'm talking about. The key kind of gross rock sections are marked. So the rock that is the cap rock, the seal, is the section in green above us, and the plover interval, which we believe is very thick, and this sort of orangey color here. I should have said that the horizontal line that's dashed through here is the depth level of the gas-water contact in the well, which is obviously very well calibrated because we've drilled through it. Okay, so you can see that basically the top of the plover rises above that level all the way up to the fault, and indeed domes up in this fault area here, rather than just actually going up in a linear fashion, as I showed on my sketch on the previous slide. So that actually looks like quite a significant volume of gas there that's above the contact. And to give you an impression of scale there, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have spotted that I put a gherkin in here. That's the Gherkin Tower from the City of London. That's a tower that's about 180 meters tall. So you'll see that on this particular transect, and indeed a long trend here, we're looking at a gas column height of about 150 to 160 meters. So a very thick, substantial column of gas. And so let's see next how that does actually map out in 3 dimensions across the data set. Okay. So the map here on the left is a map at approximately the top of the reservoir, on top of the plover. Okay, I've tilted it slightly just to give a bit of an impression in 3 dimensions, but basically this is like a topographic map of the surface of the Earth, but it's a map on that reservoir level down at about 2,800, 3,000 meters. It's colored such that warm colors are high, so the orange area here, for example, going towards sunrise, or progressively towards a high, and the colder colors, the blues and purples, are low, deep. Okay, so what you can see is that essentially as you come down from the big high of sunrise to the north of us, we go through a little bit of a saddle and then a ridge that is developed across the entirety of the 3D area. So I should have said that the 3D area that we've been working with is this rectangle here, and the PSC boundary itself is this line here. Okay, so we've got this ridge that's developed through the core of the data, And on that ridge, we've got a number of features identified, including the Chuditch discovery, and the sort of the low behind it sets up all that area, which is a focus for gas migration just here. The Chuditch discovery itself is outlined, we believe, by this sort of pink polygon, and that's the location of the well, away from the crest, which, as I was showing on the profile just now, which is situated just about here, close to the well. There is a big, that domed high up against the fault that runs through almost 20 kilometres, about 20 kilometres along that fault zone there. Between the well and the fault, it's about 1.5 to 2 kilometres, and a zone that's about 150, 160 metres high for a great deal of that length. So that's setting up a really very simple structural configuration of a connected volume of reservoir, we believe, in that big, long, elongated, tall zone. Behind it, there's a sort of lower relief areas at the back of the field, including this lobe that sticks out here for quite some distance from the in the northwesterly direction, away from the main part of the field, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Remaining within the 3D, but moving southwards, we come to the old Chuditch Southwest prospect. Now that's changing character somewhat. It's a very large area that's within this polygon here that represents that prospective area, but it's actually a little bit more amorphous in character. You'll note that there are several culminations that are developed, one here, one along this fault zone here, and then a broad low relief area that sits behind it. And then indeed, it would seem with almost a hole in the middle of it, sort of donut shape. Okay, so there's a little bit more complexity there, probably a smaller column over a larger area, but still a very large area, that's enclosure. A little bit further to the west is a new feature that we haven't really discussed before, which is called Quokka. Now this is a feature that had been identified in the past. It had been thought to be reasonably small. The name dates from earlier mapping. But what we're now seeing is that it actually is identifiable on the 3D and looks to be somewhat larger, and a fairly simple structure that's set up behind the fault there. Okay, so that's a new feature that we haven't documented previously. And then going the other direction, northwards from Chuditch, the next feature, which is almost connected, is the Chuditch Northeast lead. And again, this is a feature that is not entirely within the 3D. You see that there's a large area is now seen to be within the 3D, but it extends beyond the 3D into the area where we have only two-dimensional mapping on older data. But still, we are seeing this as being now really pretty robust. And interestingly, because it sits between the Chuditch well, the Chuditch discovery, and Sunrise, and gas having been generated in this area and effectively migrated across northwards from here towards Sunrise, or at least a lot of the gas from Sunrise we believe has come in this direction. And in essence, what we believe happens is that Chuditch has filled up with gas, and that gas has spilled and gone up northwards into the Chuditch Northeast lead, and as that has filled, then more gas has gone northwards towards Sunrise. And so what we're talking about there is a very low risk feature, we believe, for charging with gas, but more work is required to understand it because it's not entirely within the 3D area itself. So this kind of describes the characteristics of the features as they're now looking on the mapping. Again, work in progress, but our understanding of it is advancing considerably. Okay, I'll stick with the same map and I will just recolor it to show you where we think that gas sits and talk a little bit about our preliminary view on the resources associated with this new mapping. Okay, so again, exactly the same map, but where it's colored in red is where we see it above gas contacts and might be in place. Okay, so a very large area that's covered in red there, large gas volumes, discovered, of course, in Chuditch, and then the prospects and leads in the other features. Now, overall, what we're seeing here is a significant increase in the aggregate gas volumes across the PSC, and in particular, a concentration of gas resources into the Chuditch discovery, which is great news. The discovered gas feature looks to be significantly bigger than it was. But we're seeing better definition across the board in terms of that discovery and the prospects themselves, including the 2D leads or the partially 2D based leads that extend beyond the 3D. So I'll talk a little bit through the resources table that's here, the table that went out in the press release a couple of days ago, and explain those numbers and what they mean. And we've deliberately put a before and after set of numbers here. The before numbers, that basically by that I mean numbers that were in the resource report from the middle of last year, which were reported on then. And we're reporting the best case, mid case numbers from that probabilistic distribution in the Energy 360 report. And those are the most like-for-like numbers for our present deterministic in-house numbers, management numbers, which are in these columns with the orange headers. Okay, so this is where we are at the moment. We've got some work to do to refine these, to make them probabilistic, but they are our best estimates at the present time. In each set, we talk about three sets of numbers. We talk about the gas in place. Now that's the gas that is in under the ground that we believe is within each of those structures as shown on the map. We talk about recovery factor. Basically means how much of that gas, what percentage of that gas we think we can get out. And previously a blanket, with a lesser understanding of the features, a blanket number of 75% as a reasonable estimate was applied to the discovery and to each of the prospective features. Combining those two numbers then gives us a resource number. That means basically how much gas can you get out of the ground and ultimately take to market. Okay, so I'll take each of the features in turn. Now, firstly, Chuditch number one, that's the Chuditch discovery. On the previous mapping, on the poorer data, we thought there was about 950 billion cubic feet of gas in place. And that converted into a resource number of about 700 BCF, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation. On this new mapping, the feature that covers a larger area and with the refined understanding of the geometry that I've described, we're looking at about 1.8 trillion cubic feet of gas in place. And given the simplicity of the structure that I've described, we believe that would convert into a recoverable gas number of about 1.35 trillion cubic feet, TCF. Okay, now that's almost a doubling in volume of gas within the discovered feature, which is obviously tremendously good news and very exciting, and we're focusing on that. I'll come back to that a little bit more, but firstly, talk about some of the prospective features. Chuditch West and Chuditch North, from which we reported previously and have not cited numbers here and have not included, they're not annotated on the map. So let me explain that. Now, firstly, Chuditch West was a feature that was identified on previous mapping and located about here. Okay, now there's no prospect now there, but you'll notice that it's adjacent to this new lobe that has developed and which is amalgamated into the Chuditch discovery itself. And in essence, what's happened is as we've built a better understanding of the velocity structure of the Earth above us, that feature has basically migrated a little bit and has become part of the greater Chuditch area. So if you like, the Chuditch West resources we reported previously are now part of the Chuditch discovery. If you like, we've drilled that prospect without actually having to drill it. It's become part of the discovered resource. Now, Chuditch North was a feature to the north of Chuditch, lying roughly in this zone here. There's a similar story there. There's nothing there now to see. The prospect has essentially disappeared, but that's not really the case. The structure has morphed somewhat, and so again, I think those resources have effectively transferred into Chuditch Northeast as a prospect, a lead, and to the Chuditch discovery itself. Referring to Chuditch Northeast, now previously on the older mapping, we saw a volume in place of about 1.3 TCF in a mid case, which converted into just under a TCF of recoverable gas resource, and it was recognised as the most risky feature because it was within the part outside of the 3D area and would not be so well defined. We're now looking at a gas resource in place of just under 2 trillion cubic feet in our best case here. We're applying a somewhat more modest recovery factor. It's a fairly arbitrary number that we're looking to refine, but given it's a broader area and given the lesser understanding around it at the moment, we think that's appropriate. So that converts into about 1.3 TCF of gas, roughly the same size as we're now reporting for Chuditch, so effectively like a second Chuditch. Again, very encouraging resource numbers associated with that. Moving the other direction, Chuditch Southwest, we previously talked about 640 or so BCF of gas in place, converting to just under half a TCF of recoverable gas. As described, we're now seeing that it covers a larger area, but a fairly broad amorphous feature. The larger area converts into a larger gas in place number of 1.15 TCF, as shown here. But we consider that given it's a broader area, given the more amorphous nature of it, that a lower recovery factor is probably going to be appropriate once the work is done. So here we've assumed 50%, and that gives us a recoverable gas number of about 575 billion cubic feet. Not a great deal different from the previous number, and we'll see how that shakes out as we complete the work. And lastly, the Quokka feature, that's the lead shown to the further to the west, as I say, was not reported on previously. That looks like a pretty interesting add-on feature in its own right, probably with about 400 BCF of recoverable gas expected at the end of the work that we're presently doing. Okay, so rolling all of that up, we're now seeing that we think an in-place gas number for the PSC, that's both the discovered and the prospective features. The in-place number looks like 5.5 trillion cubic feet compared to 3.9 previously, so moving very much in the right direction, but with a variety of recovery factors likely to be applied as we go forward, meaning that we're expecting to see something like 3.6 trillion cubic feet of recoverable gas across all of these features. Hugely attractive numbers. I should maybe give you some sort of comparison for scale. So here we were talking about 1.35 TCF of gas for Chuditch discovery alone. That's more than the total amount of gas that the UK produces in a year from the entire offshore regions of the UK, which is about 1.1, 1.2 trillion cubic feet last year. So these are very, very material numbers, and obviously we're excited as to the direction we're going. Okay, so let me summarize some of the points I've been making in this section of the presentation. That's the last of the subsurface technical materials. So the map on the left is one that we put out previously as what we thought the discovery prospects and leads look like, and the central map is an updated version representing our new summary of it. It initially looks kind of similar, but in detail there are some significant changes, and our confidence in some of these features is now considerably increased. So to summarize, we feel that the 3D reprocessing exercise has been extremely helpful, that it has been pretty successfully carried out, and it's leading us to see that the Chuditch field has materially increased in size, and so as a value exercise, it's been extremely worthwhile. And we've not only seen larger size, but we've got a great deal more confidence in the features we're seeing, and we're de-risking the Chuditch discovery in particular before appraisal drilling with the work that we've been doing. We now expect that the appraisal well will test something in the order of 1.3 TCF of gas, more than 1.3 TCF of gas, and as a large connected volume. And that's a number that would almost certainly be commercial. And the simplicity of the structure that I described means that you probably expect to have fewer development wells required to evacuate that gas, to produce that gas going forward. So again, very encouraging developments associated with doing this work. The adjacent prospectivity has clearly evolved. Features have moved around as I've described, but it's looking robust, and the numbers associated with the features has increased. And so we're looking at an overall resource number now for the block in excess of 3.6 trillion cubic feet. I point out that a key part of that is the Chuditch Northeast feature, and that is one that does require further work, and in particular, ideally further 3D data would be acquired in the future to bring that within the volume of 3D data that we have to work with to de-risk that before future exploration drilling. But that 3D would undoubtedly follow a successful appraisal well on Chuditch itself, which is planned for late next year. And so I'll just update you a little bit on our thinking with respect to that appraisal well. I have previously shown the diagram on the left-hand side there, which is a profile through one of the sections through the Chuditch field and where we think we would drill a well. It's shown as a cartoon, but it's based on the real data. And what we've described is essentially replicating the Shell well, but diverting it into the thicker gas zone. So the vertical line shown there is the well that Shell drilled, and as described, we think it was on the edge of a large gas volume that is much thicker, closer to the fault. And so the sort of well we would like to drill would be targeted and deviated at an inclined angle to target that much thicker gas zone. We're starting to look at what that well might look like now we have better data. We've got the 3D data to work with, and identifying a number of possible locations where it could be placed. We previously assumed it'd be very close to the original well, but as shown on this map here, which is a map of the bathymetry, we can see a number of locations in shallow water where it may be possible to drill that well. This bathymetric map also shows you the complexity of the seabed in this area. Some canyons cutting through it, some highs and lows that are developed, and that's part of the reason why the seismic data has been so challenging in this area. The initial sound waves going down follow a very complicated pathways. But anyway, these shallow water zones that we located here, these locations would be appropriate for a simple, cheaper jack-up rig to be present to drill that appraisal well. That well, as I say, targeting a gas zone where we hope to have something like 150-meter column, testing that 1.3 TCF of connected volume. And because we'd be looking to test a larger connected volume, we think we'd probably be able to prove commerciality with a single good tested appraisal well. And that would remove the need for an immediate back-to-back exploration well, which I've talked about previously, because you're achieving testing the same volume with a single well. Okay, great piece of news. That appraisal well looks like it should cost about $24 million US, and I quote that including the formation test to see how well the formation would produce. Good. So, assuming a successful appraisal well, then what does the development look like? And we've talked a little bit about development possibilities in the past, but now with the refined mapping, we can refine our thinking to a great degree. And the simplicity and the increased size of the Chuditch feature means that we're now seeing that we can probably take a phased approach to development, starting with Chuditch itself and then moving on to the other features, rather than having to drill them all up and then develop it all together. And with the advantage that you can probably develop the field more quickly, but also that you can sustain, by progressively bringing in additional gas resources, that you can sustain a long plateau of gas production for a significant period of time as delivery into an LNG facility, probably. So what I mean by that is essentially you would drill the Chuditch field and develop that with a surface facility, a platform there. 6 development wells are what we're presently looking at, principally targeted on that thick gas zone along the fault there. So a pretty simple evacuation of large volumes of gas along that fault, and maybe also going into that lobe off to the west-northwest. Once Chuditch starts to be depleted after a number of years of plateau production, you could then tie back and bring in the Chuditch northeast area, which looks like a similar sort of volume again, about 5 development wells assumed up there, and then ultimately later in life move southwards and bring in the Chuditch west and Quokka volumes. Now, taking that approach, you'd hope to achieve something like the production plateau that I'm showing on the right hand side there, and we're looking at about 300 million cubic feet per day of sales gas, by which I mean gas from which CO2 has been removed and a certain amount of fuel used, and that would convert to about 2 million tons per year of LNG production. Okay, now for scale, that represents about 10% of the import capacity of the UK. So again, a very material volumes of LNG that we think could come from taking this sort of approach. So a simple approach with a long plateau is what we think is achievable. And as I say, because you're simplifying the model, we believe we can get to first gas in a pretty healthy timeline, and the target there is 2028. Okay, now I'll address a little bit the question that will inevitably arise as to why do you think you can get there quickly in a broader macro sense, and I'll point out that Chuditch has, in our view, a number of unique attributes that do facilitate an accelerated development pathway, and I'll list some of those on the left hand side. Now, firstly, we do have an enforced production sharing contract. Now that sounds kind of trivial and obvious, but take, for example, Sunrise to the north of us, as I mentioned earlier, there is not yet a PSC in place. We have our PSC, we've been operating for a few years now, it's in good standing and with very good relationships. We are exclusively within Timor-Leste waters. So there's only one government involved. The government of Timor-Leste is very supportive of what we're trying to do and very encouraging. We have scale. The chart on the right-hand side illustrates the comparative gas volumes associated with the main fields on the map, and you'll note that we're of the same order of magnitude as Barossa, which is under development, and Bayoundan, which has been producing for about 18 years. Okay, so we have the right sort of volumes. We're in the same reservoirs, and indeed we have some of the best reservoirs on this trend, in our opinion, as I was illustrating earlier on. We're also in shallow water, as I pointed out, and the blue histogram here is illustrating the water depths for a number of fields on the trend. Like Bayoundan, we're mostly at sort of between 50 and 80 meters of water depth across the field area. But as you go progressively eastwards through Evans, Shoal, Barossa, and ultimately towards Abadi, or northwards to Sunrise, you get into progressively deeper and deeper water. Deep water translates into more cost, more expensive drilling, more expensive facilities, and to some extent more time. And so we have the advantage there of shallow water. We also have CO2, like many of the fields there. There's about 18% CO2 in the gas in Chuditch from the discovery well. But we do have a plan with respect to that CO2 in the form of CCS, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Okay, lastly, I would also point out, just very briefly as an aside, the Kelp Deep discovery off to the at the right end of the chart there. We don't really see any reducible volumes associated with that discovery, so it's not something that we include within our assessment of the basin. Okay, moving on. So the gas, then, assuming everything I've said is right and you can take it forward, the next question is, where will that gas go and how will you get it there? Now, obviously, the target is to deliver shredded gas to Asian energy markets, which are robust, and the price environment is extremely strong. So the Asian energy markets, but the challenge is getting there. And we see a multitude of pathways. I've put up a diagram like this previously and talked around it in detail. But there are many arrows on there, and they talk to different routes you can follow. But broadly speaking, we can categorize those as several different things. Firstly, there's pipeline to LNG, to shore-based LNG facilities, and that might mean going northwards to the island of Timor-Leste, to a greenfield LNG development, almost certainly through the Greater Sunrise facilities, which are obviously not yet in place, and then through the deeper water that is present between Sunrise and the island of Timor. Now that's all very doable, but the question is essentially what's going to happen to Sunrise gas and when is it going to happen? And those are questions that are outstanding. And so that brings uncertainty as to that potential pathway. We can go southwards towards Darwin. There are 2 LNG facilities in Darwin. It's shallow water most of the way, it's shallow water all of the way. And we can go there either directly or leapfrogging or piggybacking on infrastructure that will emerge in Barossa or Evans Shoal. The issues to some extent in going that direction are that you've got to cross a maritime boundary, an international border, and you've got a multitude of third-party arrangements that need to be put in place with other operators, including the LNG facilities, to enable Chuditch gas to be accommodated. And so, again, doable, but with some fairly large challenges to face in doing so. And the third choice is to do something standalone, by which we do something at the Chuditch facility itself, at the location. And that might be a floating LNG concept. It might be a platform fixed facility with an LNG concept on it, or indeed a hybrid of those two. And I'll illustrate that in a moment in a bit more detail. You could also look at compressed natural gas as an alternative solution, although that's a bit less commonly applied offshore. Also, the Chuditch CO2, the choices that are available to us to deal with the CO2 that's present are several-fold, but as annotated here, one option is to take a pipeline to Bayoundan, which will emerge as a CCS facility once production ceases, or indeed to inject back into the Plover sandstones at the Chuditch location, effectively as a dedicated CCS facility for Chuditch. In many ways, that looks like a favourable thing to do. And all of this thinking around CCS is part of a sort of a broader strategy that ultimately Chuditch should be developed as a net zero LNG facility in tandem with long-term buyers of Chuditch gas. Okay, so I'd just like to illustrate a little bit more what I meant by that hybrid solution. And the reason I'm picking on this one is because a standalone solution as described is, I think, the approach which is most likely to enable us to achieve expedited gas development and achieve that 2028 target that I've talked about. Now, by the hybrid facility, what I really mean is leveraging the fact that we're in shallow water to have quite a lot of the facilities present on a processing platform, and that platform then being adjacent to a floating LNG vessel. Now, of course, you could just do the vessel itself, or indeed just processing the LNG platform-based facility on its own as well. But the hybrid facility is quite a good way to go. That was what was done by Petronas, for example, in Malaysia, or off the coast of Borneo, the world's first floating LNG facility, which has been in operation for more than 6 years. We took exactly that approach of putting some facilities on a platform and some on the floating on the vessel itself. The advantage here is that, of course, you don't need to go across maritime boundaries, and there are no long pipelines that are required, with all the benefits, cost, environmental, etc., that come with taking that approach. Okay, so it's the same approach to developing the field as described, in a phased fashion, but with that central facility being targeted to immediately exporting and taking you off to market. That also brings quite a lot of flexibility in how you handle the asset, and indeed how you finance it going forward. And lastly, just to mention, as I have, the CO2 handling would also be done at that platform, and then the choices as described are either a pipeline that goes off towards Bioland, or potentially more likely a couple of injector wells as shown here. Really, you'd only need one, but you'd have a backup that would then be just taking that CO2 back down into the plover. It's a very efficient way of dealing with the CO2 that's handled in the gas and storing it forever. So that takes me to the end of the updates I wanted to give you around the project. You see, I've gone from reservoir scale effectively to gas in the ground, through the sort of resources and the mapping that we're now doing on new data, and ultimately to what we think we can do with the gas, and what the vessel might look like that would handle it and enable it to be exported to market. Before I hand back to Andy Yeo to wrap up, though, there's a couple of other areas I wanted to just cover very briefly. The first of which is the competent persons report that we've announced that we have commissioned. We have engaged ERCE to provide this report for us. They're a technical auditor that specialises in this sort of work. They're London-based and work with a lot of AIM-listed E&P clients, and so maybe well known to a number of people on the call. But they also have a lot of experience in Southeast Asia, in Asia, across Asia Pacific, as indicated by all the yellow dots on the map there, including in Timor-Leste, where they've worked on the other big fields that are present offshore. Okay, they'll be providing a report that's validates our resources, hopefully to industry standards. And we're very hopeful that will include a determination that the gas in the Chuditch discovery itself can be classified as contingent resources. They'll be providing some assistance on the reservoir engineering side to give us a better idea as to which recovery factors to apply. And it's work that started, and they're working in parallel with us, and so hopefully we'll be able to produce a report not long after we have completed all the internal studies that we're working very hard to get through. Okay, and I'll finish with just a couple of words on some of the activities that we're carrying out in country from a more ESG and social involvement perspective. As you're aware, Chuditch is a country that it's young, with a very young population, and it's one of the poorest countries in this hemisphere. It's got a lot of development challenges, but it's resource rich, and it's hungry to do things with those resources to assist it on the development pathway, and it's trying to enhance its capacity building and help that young generation deliver the more wealth to the country to take it forward. And we're trying to do our little bit, punching above our weight in assisting with knowledge transfer initiatives to enable them to develop that capacity within the energy sector. And so these are, let me describe that a little bit more. So basically, we have obviously got a presence in country, but it's a meaningful presence. We have an office, a team of 5 capable people, and we're mentoring and training that team, exposing them to real work that's helpful to the project. We're maximising our local content in everything we're doing around them, but we're also reaching out and developing relationships with some of the academic institutions where people are trained up. An awful lot of young geoscientists who are being trained, but who want exposure to real projects that are going on. We signed an MOU recently with the Delhi Institute of Technology, one of the important universities in Delhi, covering knowledge sharing and collaboration. We share our training programs with the junior colleagues in our partner companies, and we're working closely with the Institute of Petroleum Geology locally to help them with collaborative events and providing guest speakers, etc., to assist in this knowledge sharing exercise. So these initiatives, which are very low cost, but they do have a very material impact. They're well recognised, and we are being credited for the efforts that we're making there as a responsible operator in country. They're efforts which I'm personally proud, and I think reflect very well on your company. So with that, I'll hand back to Andy Yeo to wrap up, and I look forward to taking any questions that you have later in the call. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. So we have a lot of work ahead of us over the coming months, which will hopefully culminate in a successful farm out. To date, we've successfully delivered the 3D seismic reprocessing, which has led to a significant increase in the resource estimates, which may now lead to or represent an LNG scale resource. Chuditch 1 discovery has been de-risked and is materially larger, and the follow-up prospects and leads portfolio also appears robust. We are now looking at a simpler phased development concept with an appraisal well drilling in 2023 onwards, and we are targeting a fast-track LNG development pathway utilising a hybrid FLNG system. We're also fortunate that we're bringing these projects forward when issues such as energy security and structural imbalances in LNG indicate a sustained period of high prices for oil and gas. So that's enough, I think, from us. I think we probably should move now to questions and answers, and I would propose to hand back to Tim.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and thank you very much, Andy Butler, for a fascinating presentation. Thank you for everybody who's submitted questions in advance, really appreciated. Thank you very much for those who've been typing away while Andy's been presenting. I'll do my best to get through as many of these as we possibly can, but recognise that we won't be able to answer everything. If there are things that you think have been missed, things that you think we can answer, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Contact details are on the bottom of all of the announcements, and we will do our best to get through those questions. But just looking at the list of questions that I've got on the screen here, the presentation obviously focused on Chuditch, but before we move to that, we've had a few questions on the UK licence P2478. Andy, I don't know if you can comment on what progress has been made on this licence, which obviously contains the Dunrovin prospect.
Yeah, no, I think probably the best person to answer that one is probably John, actually.
Yes, sorry, John.
On the basis that John's looking after it in the UK. So
yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. Good evening, everybody. On P2478, then, that's the 32% share we have in an offshore UK licence containing the large shallow Dunrovin feature. We estimated some 100 million barrels gross potential resource at the start of the licence. And since then, the technical studies that we've done are progressing well, I'm pleased to report, and as planned. Most of it is seismic reprocessing, and I'd like to just make a little pitch from the technical side of things. You've seen all the fantastic work that Andy Butler and his team have done, and I think it justifies the approach that BAN has taken to be technically top of the class. At the moment, we are reaching the interpretation conclusion of that new seismic. And I'm pleased to say we're seeing, again, like Chuditch, a step change in confidence in that seismic image. We can see for the first time into the reservoir, which is the Beatrice reservoir. And we are now just trying to round up all of that interpretation, combine it with all the other geological studies. For example, we've done quite a bit of geochemical analysis in the area. And we're just at that final step now of integrating all that new information. I think there's good grounds for optimism that the significant prospectivity will be confirmed, but we're not quite there yet. But it's the next one off the line after Chuditch, in our view.
Absolutely. Is there any more you can say about the next steps in that project?
Yeah, we, along with our joint venture partners, Rebuild Resources, who used to be Canadian, they are the operator, and with whom we've got a good relationship. We are meeting with them regularly, and there's going to be a crunch meeting coming up in the not too distant future. And at that meeting, we're going to be discussing and agreeing the revised risks and revised resources that we see coming out of all of this interpretation. So that will be fairly soon, and of course we will be reporting to the market at the appropriate time after that in due course. Ultimately, on the licence, there's a drill or drop decision, and that's going to be made before July 2023 next year. Before then, I expect that we will be involved probably in a joint venture farm out campaign to try to help fund an exploration well on the Dunrobin feature. There may be an element of internal funding for that exploration well. That really remains to be seen. But the market in the UK has evolved, as I'm sure we've all understood recently with energy security issues, and there's now a good tax break for drilling exploration wells if you're lucky enough to be paying a windfall tax from your production in the UK. So some good grounds there for a bit of optimism that the farm out market is moving in our favour.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, John. We'll now move on to Chuditch, and obviously the majority of the questions have been on that. Just a couple of clarification questions before we go on. I've had a questioner type in during the presentation. Does the gas numbers that we've reported, does that actually include the CO2 component, or is it actually just usable gas?
No, we report numbers that are net of CO2, so that's after the gas has been taken out. So the resource number that is shown is a sales gas number net of CO2.
Excellent, thank you. And the next clarification question, we've used the word preliminary analysis and preliminary interpretation in announcements. The question says, how much more data interpretation remains to be done? When do you expect this to be completed? And do you expect much change when things are finalised?
We're obviously working very hard through the data, and as I've explained, we put an awful lot of effort into reprocessing those data, a lot of time, a lot of resource, a lot of money, frankly, to doing it and to getting it right. And as you've seen, it is a real step change that is delivered in our understanding of the resources. Now, of course, what we want to do is make sure that we interpret those data fully and get the maximum value out of it. So we are doing it in a proper technical fashion, in a very diligent way. Okay. But that said, obviously, we wouldn't be coming out and talking about these sort of numbers if we didn't have a lot of confidence in the work that we're doing. So they will change. Of course, they'll change. But I think we're getting into a ballpark that is the right one. It's where we'll end up. They'll change particularly with respect to, in particular, I think, with respect to the features that are not entirely within the 3D. Because moving from two very, very different sort of data sets and trying to come up with a combined picture that is consistent is challenging, and that's taking a little while to get that right. And they will change as we get some sort of feedback also from ERCE, that may impact our thinking a little bit. There's an awful lot of detail in there, but we are working it very hard. It will probably takes the rest of this year certainly to wrap up a lot of that interpretation. So I imagine it'll take us kind of into the start of next year. But we'll see. Don't hold me too much to that. We want to make sure we do it properly, so that the numbers that we bring out, the information that we're providing to ERCE to enable them to come up with independent validation numbers that the market can also rely on. We're going to do it right, and we'll get there as fast as we can, whilst without any shortcuts.
Excellent. Well, the remainder of the question, I had lots of questions, so these won't be in any particular order, and apologies to everybody attending that we'll be dotting around a little bit here. But I've had one person type in and ask about the weather as a factor. You know, you talk about drilling, you talk about possibility of floating platforms. Is the weather a significant issue, and are there periods of the year when you literally can't drill and produce?
Great question, actually, and yes, it is a consideration, as it is in many places, but it's not a serious issue here as it is in some other regions. The sort of the typhoon season, the season where it's most, where the weather is the worst, is the very start of the year, period sort of January through February, March. But really, what that principally means is that it's likely to take a bit longer, because there may be short periods where you have to stop. We're not in a significant typhoon belt. We're sort of more on the margin of it, but extreme weather events happen, as we all know. But the greatest risk that there may be some weather disruption is early in the year. The shell discovery itself, the Chuditch discovery was drilled right at the end of the year, sort of November, December time, so kind of close to that period, and we're sort of into the wet season in Dili now itself, and they drilled that well in an exceptionally short time in a very efficient way. So yeah, weather's a consideration, as it is everywhere. It has some impact, but not an enormous impact.
And you mentioned Shell there. I've had a fair few people ask me, can you comment on why you thought Shell gave up the asset in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's look back. I mean, it's almost 25 years ago that Shell drilled that well. They were drilling a number of features along this trend. Now, 25 years ago, there was not the gas market that we have today at all. There was not the LNG market that we have today across Southeast Asia and indeed globally. And they weren't really targeting gas. They were looking more for an oil prospect. The Bayundan field was developed 8 years or so later. So there was no pipeline infrastructure, there was no LNG facilities onshore, so there was nowhere to take the gas. So gas today is a highly commercial commodity. Gas 25 years ago was not a commercial commodity. So, we were in a period in 1998, for those of you who remember, it was one of those oil price crashes as well. There was a lot of corporate stresses, a lot of things going on more broadly in a macro sense. But in essence, there wasn't, gas was a failure at that time, whereas actually what they found was large gas that today is highly valuable. And I could probably go a bit further on that. I mean, we're in a highly advantageous position where we have this asset, we've spent some time and money on it, we've reprocessed data, but basically we are benefiting from an enormous amount of prior investment. And the well that was drilled, all of the seismic data, all the 3D data that was acquired that we've been able to reprocess. And were you to go out and do all of that from scratch today, it would probably cost you about $50 million for all of those activities. So frankly, that's our good luck that the timing now is right to do something with gas, which previously it was not.
There is one other thought as well, of course, Tim, that in the middle of all that, there was still a civil war going on with Indonesia. So they, at some point that needed to be resolved. So, if you put all that together, you probably wouldn't want to be going forward in that particular scenario, would you?
No, indeed. But one of the things, Andy Butler, you mentioned there was oil. Has there actually been any signs of oil prospects in the data that you've been looking at on Chuditch?
Well, the short answer is no. This is a gas feature. Now, it's an interesting question. When you look at some of the other fields around us, Bayundan has a lot of liquids associated with the gas. Sunrise has a lot of liquids associated with the gas. And indeed, Bayundan was originally developed as a liquids project with the gas recycled and then developed later on. But when you come to where Chuditch is and going westwards towards Evan Shoal, for example, actually the gas is a lot drier, which means that there's not very much liquid associated with it. And there are good geological reasons why we think that's the case. We put an awful lot of effort into modeling that and trying to understand it. And the discovery well found very dry gas, very little liquid associated with it. And our work is concluding that actually that's probably not much of a sampling issue associated with that it's genuinely the case. So this is purely a gas commodity, in our view, in Chuditch and across this PSC. In some ways, that actually simplifies matters as well, because you're developing one commodity, not two, with the same facility.
Yeah. And you talk about simplification and the PSC. I've had a question here. Do any of our prospects actually cross over into particularly Block P that belongs to ENI or indeed anybody else's territory, or into Australia, for example?
Well, no, they do not extend northwards into Block P to the north of us. You can see from the maps I was showing that's the case. There's that saddle before you go up towards Sunrise. They don't extend into the block to the west of us. That block's actually unlicensed. It was not signed up in the licensing round. You go into a different sort of zone in that direction. And we are right on the maritime boundary with Australia, but we believe all the resources are pretty much inside Timor-Leste waters. So they are self-contained within the PSC.
Okay.
And that's important, Tim, on the basis of we've seen what's happening with Greater Sunrise, where one of the big issues there is that it has to be unitized because it's split across. Largely in Timor, but a big chunk of it was also sits in the Australian waters, which adds complication to the whole process.
Yeah. And I've had a number of questions about the relationship with the Timor-Leste government. and really how supportive they are of the project, how supportive they are of options such as using floating natural gas platforms and exploiting this, in the simplest way rather than using infrastructure on land in Timor-Leste, for example.
Well, firstly, our relationships with government are very good, and it's one of the advantages of working in a relatively small country. Frankly, is that we are a big fish in a small pond. There, we have very frequent meetings with government at a whole number of levels, and then they're extremely supportive of what we're trying to do. They appreciate some of the efforts that I talked about at the end of my piece. But in particular, they appreciate the fact we're trying to expedite this project, that we're putting a lot of technical work into it. They appreciate the quality of the technical work some of which I've shown today, and they see that that they're very, very focused. It's a country that desperately needs to develop its resources to ensure its sort of long-term sustainability as a nation and to provide opportunity to its young population. They are very focused on Sunrise as a giant world-class asset to the north of us, and that gets a lot of media attention, and then they're correctly focused on that, and one of their drivers is to make sure that this turns into real opportunity for the nation, not just generating wealth, but spreading that out, creating jobs, etc. But they're also very focused on the fact that they need revenue, and they need, Bayu-Undan, as I mentioned, is about to come off stream, and that has provided the lion's share of revenues since independence was achieved 20 years ago. And that's going off stream means that revenue stream is drying up, and they'll be dependent for some time on the petroleum fund, which is a sovereign wealth fund that they put in place for some of those revenues. And so where I'm going is that, in essence, we talk to them about the opportunities to develop Chuditch that we see. I certainly would not put up diagrams illustrating different development scenarios without having shown those to the government first of all. So they're very aware of our thinking around this asset. They're supportive because they see that actually, where traditionally assets like this might have been as something that you could tie into Sunrise as a future development and backfill it, really what this represents is an opportunity to develop something before Sunrise and in parallel before Sunrise to generate revenues that actually would assist them with funding Sunrise, and certainly would assist them with cash flow in the shorter term. So, I obviously can't speak for the government, but I can say that I get a very good hearing, and they are supportive in all the conversations that we have with them.
Thank you. Very good to hear. We've talked about a data room being established and multiple parties, looking at that, and obviously they'll be looking at the new data. Can you comment on the types of parties? I understand that for commercial reasons we can't name any names, but the sort of parties who are showing interest.
Certainly. I mean, obviously, I don't wish to say very much on this subject, but just stepping back, we're talking about large gas resources in this region in shallow water, and obviously that attracts a fair amount of interest, and a lot more interest today than it may have done in the past. And so we are getting attention, getting interest. We're talking to a number of companies, and they represent a wide variety of potential investors into a project like that. So you're talking from majors through to sort of regional specialists, some sort of well-funded newcomers to the region that are looking at gas in Asia as a good market to get into. Some more sort of financial institutions or institutions that are look at things more from an infrastructure perspective. So I guess the short answer is a broad range of interest. I can't guarantee where anything will go, but we have interest, yeah.
Yeah. The other one that we might just pick up, which certainly surprised us, I think, towards the beginning of the process, really, was that we also had quite a lot of interest from the utilities themselves, and that was largely to do with certainty of demand, certainty of supply, for the utilities, particularly in Asia, where obviously they need to ensure that they've got product going into for the electricity generation purposes. So there's been a whole raft of sort of people that have been looking and talking to us about things, which is probably slightly different to the normal straight joint venture and the oil companies that you would normally think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, as you're talking now, I've got a few questions sort of more generally corporately about Baron. We've got a number of people who've said, would you consider an outright sale of either Baron or an asset if the price was right? And I suspect there's a one-word answer to this.
Well, the answer is yes. But as ever, it's getting the price right, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, this is, we are a commercial organisation. This isn't run as a lifestyle business, and at the end of the day, the one thing we don't really want to do is to produce. In that sense, I mean, it's where we want to be on the line moving forward, i.e., travelling across it. But at the end of the day, the big production units and all of that stuff that are put together to actually produce the gas isn't really our bag. We're good at exploration, and our job is to attract somebody to come in and to do the heavy lifting for us. So at some point we'll come away. But if somebody wants to make an outright bid, then that's a perfectly sensible thing to do. And actually, in a PSC, it works better that way, because the PSCs tend to be, they'd effectively be buying a company which had the license rather than trying to buy the license. And because within the PSC, you have all the tax breaks and everything that sit within that. So, in that sense, it's a perfectly sensible route for somebody to take, particularly since we've got 75%, and we are the only partner apart from the NOC in terms of Timor. So that's an obvious route if somebody actually wanted to get stuck into it.
Thank you. I think that's pretty clear. And another question I've had in a similar vein: would Baron consider investing in other assets, either in UK North Sea or elsewhere globally?
Well, we're still actively looking in terms of new ventures, and we're certainly particularly, at the moment, it's very active in the UK. I mean, we won't be fracking, by the way, but on the other hand, there is a lot going on in the UK. And it's probably something John might be able to pick up, actually, because John is looking at a number of things in terms of new ventures and potentially something on the 33rd round, John.
Yeah, of course. There's the very large UK government offering in the 33rd round, and the bids are due in January 2023 with awards Q2, Q3 2023. We are working away technically. I'm pleased to say we've already joined one joint bidding group with a very like-minded kind of company who has an advantage in excuse me, in the basin where we have less advantage, and we're looking to do more of those. So we are hoping to make some bids. That's our ambition, to bid for multiple licenses in this UK license round. And the overall aim, as we said, we've got Chuditch, we've got Dunrobin heading towards maturity. We need to reload the portfolio for the next Chuditch and the next Dunrobin. So working away at that. Certainly a license round is a very good route to get into to things with a controlled work program. That's one of our issues, and it would be in line with the corporate strategy. So high impact resources, significant equities, something we can work up. Along with that, we are always looking at new ventures, UK and elsewhere, and those are consistently and constantly under review. So yeah, that's a long answer to saying yes, we are.
Thank you, John. But in the meantime, obviously, two very, very exciting assets in Chuditch and Dunrobin. We're coming to the end of the hour and a quarter that was set aside for this, and appreciate everybody staying on board. One question I've had is, will we consider doing further presentations like this in the future? Absolutely, at the right time. Obviously, a lot of preparation work involved in it, and I'd like to thank everybody who's been involved in putting this together. As I say, we've had limited time. Any further questions, please do get in touch. My name's Tim Metcalf. Details on the announcements, Baron Oil at investor-focus.co.uk, and we'll endeavour to come back to you. But thank you very much to Andy, and John for presentation this evening. But most of all, thank you very much for everybody who's attended. Really, really appreciated, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for organising it, and thank you for everyone who's listened to it. So,
thanks.
Have a good evening.
Good night.